When I think of Islay whiskey, I normally think of heavily peated whiskies. Today we have Andy Buntine from Bruichladdich, Australia. He's the brand ambassador for Bruichladdich here in Australia, and we're going to talk everything about Bruichladdich.
Fantastic, thanks for having me. Let's do it.
It's great to have you here. So, as I said earlier in the intro, I normally think of heavily peated whiskies when I think of Islay, like your Lafroigs and your Ardbegs and so forth. Bruichladdich is a little bit different, isn't it?
It is, yes. Fantastic whiskies you just mentioned there. We like to do things a little bit different at Bruichladdich Distillery. While we respect the past of whiskey making on Islay, we don't want to stand in its shadow. So that's why we call ourselves the Progressive Hebridean Distillers. Progressive because, as I said, we don't stand in the shadow of whiskey making on Islay. We like to forge our own path, which is quite a progressive path, if you can see by just the shape and the colour of these bottles. Hebridean, Islay is the Queen of the Hebrides, which is a group of islands off the west coast of Scotland, and Distillers is pretty self-explanatory. Now we do like to do things a little bit differently. As I said, we've got 4 brands that we make at Bruichladdich Distillery. We've got Bruichladdich Whiskey, single malt, which is unpeated. We've got Port Charlotte single malt, which is heavily peated. We've got Octomore, it's another single malt, it's super heavily peated. I'll talk about that a bit later. And we've got a little gin project that we do on the side called The Botanist, which I don't have to talk about at all because George did a fantastic video a couple of weeks ago on that one.
Yeah, and it's a very good gin too. So I guess for me, I am only now drinking a lot of peated whiskies, and for me, believe it or not, the Octomore was what got me to start drinking, and we will do a tasting of it soon. But exceptional whiskey, like I really do love it, and I was lucky enough to meet Jim McEwen, who was the original distiller, and just the way that he set this distillery up and the way that they do things, like nothing's really computerized, is it? It's all done by hand. And
yeah, correct. Yeah. So Bruichladdich Distillery was founded in 1881, and it was some brothers, the Harvey brothers, who came over from Glasgow. They'd had a couple of distilleries already, and they came to Islay to make a purpose-built distillery to make single malt whiskey there. And it was one of the first distilleries on Islay that was based just to make single malt whiskey. It was, as I said, founded in 1881, and we're still using a lot of that equipment that was put in 1881. For example, our mash tun was installed in 1881. It has had a few repairs since then. And our old bobby mill, which we use for crushing up the malted barley, was installed in 1912 and is still going strong these days. In fact, the closest thing we have to a computer in the distillery is it's a float within the washback that, as the water rises, the float goes up. It's attached by a string and a couple of pulleys over to the wall with a weight on the side, which shows us how many thousands of litres we've added into the washback.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. Like I really love the romance behind the story of Bruichladdich at a time when distilleries are just churning out whiskey so quickly because there's such a high demand. It's nice to see a brand that actually takes their time and does it, really, really well. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah, and that's one of the processes that Jim instilled in us for making whiskey when he first came over from Camorra Distillery to Bruichladdich back in 2000, is that we wanted to keep that traditional style of slow distillation and very hands-on, which, without computers in the distillery, we need to be very hands-on. So we're actually the biggest private employer on Islay as well, which is fantastic. We've got about 100 people that work for us, from the distillery workers to the marketing team, to the people that run the tours and the Bruichladdich academies as well.
Awesome, fantastic. Well, you're making me thirsty talking. Which one can we try first?
Well, I think there's no point starting with the super heavily peated one, the Octomore. We'll leave that one to the end. We'll start off with the Classic Laddie. So this is our flagship whiskey. And this one is our unpeated, so I thought we'd start with unpeated and get our palates going that way, and then we'll work our way up as we go through. So
excellent. Cheers.
Mm.
Oh yeah.
So as you mentioned, the thing that's different about this single malt whiskey to other single malt whiskies on Islay is it's unpeated, which means it doesn't have that smoky phenolic characteristic that you'd expect from probably the most infamous whiskey making region, which is Islay. It's a very decisive style of whiskey with having peat smoke put in there, which is that smoky characteristic. So, you know, you either love it or you hate it. It's kind of like blue cheese. There's really no in between, and people that do love it, you know, is only a small percentage of people that do drink peated single malt whiskey.
Yeah, awesome. What is the alcohol percentage?
Yeah, fantastic. So all of our whiskies start at 50% ABV and go higher. The reason for that is we don't need to chill filter our whiskies, and we don't add any artificial colourings to them as well. So all this colour comes naturally from the cask. The reason we went for 50% is you can always add some water to it or add a little bit of ice to help bring it back down if it's, you know, not to your liking and a bit too strong. Whereas if we brought it down to 40%, you can't take that out once it's been put in there. So we're letting the drinker and, you know, the bartender be able to play around with their whiskey a little bit and have a bit of ownership for it.
Excellent. And for 50% alcohol, I actually find that it's very, very smooth. It feels like I'm drinking something that is at that 43% ABV. So yeah.
We've played around with the name. So Bruichladdich, we can break that down into two parts. Brook, which in Scotch Gaelic means on the hill, and Laddie by the water. We've actually taken that Laddie part of it, and that's where we come up with the name Classic Laddie. So in Scottish slang, Laddie means young boy. So what we want to produce here, and what Jim McKeown wanted to do when helping to resurrect Bruichladdich Distillery, was show that a young whiskey can still be as easy to drink and as smooth as a 30 or a 40-year-old whiskey. A younger whiskey just shows more characteristics of the barley, and that's something that we're really excites us at Bruichladdich is talking about barley and the barley trials that we do.
Yeah, awesome. I would definitely, for those of you that haven't tried Bruichladdich, I would absolutely go out there and buy a bottle, or come into the 18th Amendment bar. We do have all of them here on the back bar, but I really do love it. Yeah.
Right. Now, because it is a higher ABV, and we do mature all of our whiskey on Islay, within a couple of miles of the distillery is all of our maturation warehouses, so it is maturing by the seaside. Islay, being on the west coast of Scotland, is battered by the winds coming off the Atlantic Ocean. We've also got the Gulf Stream, which brings warm water from the equator up to the North Pole, which then turns into cold winds, which comes down. So there's horrible weather there, and all of our casks are sitting out there in that environment, and taking on that sea salt spray from the water. So that's where you get a little bit of saltiness coming through in this whiskey as well. A lot of people do confuse that for being peat smoke, but I can tell you there's absolutely no peat that goes into Bruichladdich whiskey.
Yeah, awesome. And do you get a little bit of that peat flavour as well, I guess, even just in the water, if the water that they use in the whiskey sort of going down through the peat bog, do you pick up any peat in an unpeated whiskey from not the actual peat smoke that goes across the barley? Not
so much, it's more the colour of the peat smoke. So peat water that comes through is quite a dark, murky colour. In fact, it probably looks like a hazy pale ale, with the colour of that. We will use some of that water in the production process, but none of it for adding to the whiskey to bring it from cask strength down to bottling strength. We've actually got our own well that we use, and it sits on Octomore Farm, which is where we get the name for the Octomore whiskey. And this well that we use is, I don't like to say pure water. We don't need to do anything to it. We don't need to use reverse osmosis to strip anything out. It is quite a soft water. It has got a lot of minerals in it, but it's a really easy water. We don't have to do anything to it. So.
Excellent, awesome. I'm going to finish this one. Excellent. So, can you tell me a little bit about, is it the Port Charlotte 10 that we're doing next?
Yes, we'll move on to the Port Charlotte. So, this one's named after the old distillery at Port Charlotte, which is the closest village on Islay to Bruichladdich Distillery, which was called the Lochindale Distillery, and it's been closed down for quite a number of years. So we do produce this at the Bruichladdich Distillery, which has got that different brand name, just to differentiate it from our non-peated whiskey, which is the Bruichladdich. So this one's heavily peated to 40 ppm. Now what ppm is, it's a measurement of the amount of phenolics that are present in the barley just after the malting process. So for every million molecules within the barley, 40 of them peat, which is that smoky characteristic.
And is that written on the bottle? So for our listeners that can they, well, I guess you could really just check on Google a lot of the time to see how heavily peated the whiskies are, because sometimes I find that it's a little bit intimidating going to a store and there's 100 and something whiskies on there and not knowing how peated they are. Like, do look up and do a little bit of research, because I didn't even know that you could check the amount of peat in your whiskies years ago, and I made a lot of mistakes and bought bottles of whiskey that only now I'm enjoying, so they were too peated. So, but let's give it a try.
Now, like the Bruichladdich, this one again is 50% ABV. This one's matured for a minimum of 10 years, hence the age statement of 10 on there, which is a bit of an ode to other core whiskies or core single malts in different distilleries on Islay that do release 10-year-olds. So it's a bit of an ode to that. Again, as I said, we respect the history of making whiskey on Islay, but we don't want to stand in its shadow. So, it is quite a progressive looking bottle that we've gone through with this one.
Yeah, no, I really love the bottles too. It's totally different, especially when the Classic came out. It's so easy to recognise on the back bar as well, which I think is a great little bit of marketing. But to see a bottle that was so different to everyone else, I kind of really liked as well. It's just, yeah.
Unfortunately, bartenders do hate us with this one being the opaque bottle. But the reason behind the colour of that is one day a year on Islay. As I said, the weather's pretty horrible on Islay, but one day a year there's the clouds will part, and it'll be a beautiful sunny day, and the sky and the water around Islay, because there's a few reefs just close by to the shore, is actually this colour. Okay. So it's not the same day every year, so I can't tell you which day is the nicest to go to Islay, but most days are nice on Islay.
I kind of like the bottle as a bartender, because when you have so many whiskies on the back bar, it's a lot easier to find it straight away. So
good point.
I can't complain about that. I really like this, and as I said before during the break, I find that with even the Port Charlotte at 50%, I don't need to add any water to it. I just find it so smooth and super tasty, whereas with some whiskies I need to just sort of add a little bit of water to open it up. I'm a fan, as you can tell. I was really excited when Andy was coming down. So
a little bit of water definitely will help to open it up, and in fact, a little bit of water will help to bring out a few more of the phenolics. And it is important to talk about phenolics here. And do you notice anything different with the flavour of the smoke style that's within this whiskey compared to other Islay whiskies?
I don't find, for me, it's as sort of medicinal as, say, for example, a Lafroig and an Ardbeg. I find it, if this was the first ever peated whiskey that I tried, I don't think I would find it as offensive as some of the others. I'm not saying that the others are bad, because I love drinking those. Is that it? Is it less medicinal? It is,
That's a really great point.
Yeah.
The style of peat that we use differs from what they use on Islay. On Islay, they source their peat from Islay. Just to quickly explain what peat is it's 1,000-year-old, really slowly decomposing plant matter. And what it does is it becomes a really huge terrestrial store of carbon. So it's kind of, like a tree will store carbon, that's how it gets bigger. Peat does the same thing, and you can actually burn it. It's like a magic mud that burns really well, and it contains these molecules called phenolics, which is that smoky flavour you get in Islay whiskies. We source our peat from the mainland. We use the maltings of Baird's in Inverness, and they source theirs from the Highlands. So it's, rather than being a medicinal iodine seaside style of peat, it's more of what we call a barbecue style of peat smoke.
Yeah, for me it's sort of like a campfire sort of smoke compared to that. You'll know if you've had the other ones, you know the difference.
So it's definitely a lot more approachable. And if you wanted to measure this one against other Islay whiskies, this being 40 ppm, Lafroig is also 40 ppm. You've got Kalila, I think, is 35 ppm. Lagavulin is 30, so it's all sitting around that same amount. Ardbeg 55 ppm, I think it is, or 45, just off the top of my head. So it kind of sits around the same as those whiskies, but I definitely think it's a lot more approachable with the style of peat that we use.
Yeah, awesome. Super, super good. Okay, well, we might move on to the Octomore. What do you think?
Yeah, sure thing. Let's do it. So in this amazing bottle here, we have the Octomore whiskey, which is another single malt from Bruichladdich Distillery. And this one is super heavily peated, and it's very famous, or probably more infamous, because it is so heavily peated. The story behind this is when Jim McEwen, who is our outgoing master whiskey maker, and Adam Hannett, who is our current whiskey maker, we're talking to Baird's in Inverness about how they get the peating levels to 40 ppm so consistently with the Port Charlotte. They told us that they actually peat higher than that. So they'll peat up to about 80 ppm and then use unpeated barley to cut it back. So if we wanted to get to 40 ppm and they did it to 80, they'll put the equal amounts of unpeated barley in to bring it back. So it's just a simple mathematical equation to work that one out. So we put it to them and said, you know, what if we wanted to do as high as we can? And they said, oh, it's not going to be a very nice whiskey. You know, we've never really done it before. It just would be unpalatable. So we said, you know, let's do a test and see how it goes. So back in 2003, we got some peated barley, which was 80.5 ppm, they measured. And we did that, and we distilled it. We used our slow trickle style distillation, even at cask strength, or even, you know, coming straight off the stillet, you know, that around that 67.5%, which is what we cask at. It was delicious. It was unlike anything anyone had ever tried before. So we thought, let's do this, and let's do what we call now the impossible equation. So super heavily peated cask strength whiskey, almost cask strength, and it's absolutely a delicious whiskey to drink. And you know, as we say, the rest is history with that one. And you know, it's only a very small percentage of what we produce every year at Bruichladdich Distillery, but it's definitely the most famous from that distillery, especially with what we call them peat heads. People that love these big ones. So the first one we ever did was 80.5, and we have gotten up to 309.7 ppm with the 8.3 release of the Octomore.
That's crazy, and it was so good too. It didn't last long here at 18. The Octomore is very, very popular, and as we can't get it quick enough. And as I said earlier, it's what started me drinking peated whiskey, which is strange to drink the most heavily peated whiskey at the time. And I remember spending a little bit of time with Jim McEwen on a tour, because I was doing a little bit of work for South Trade at the time, and he's such a charismatic person too, and just how he said, I just couldn't believe how well balanced it was for the alcohol percentage and the smoke and the peat level. And he just said it's that trickle distillation and the way that they made it. And yeah, good on them, good luck to them, because there's been a few other brands that have done those super heavy peated ones as well, but I find that for me Octomore is the better one, in my opinion.
So we call this one the Iron Fist in the Velvet Glove.
Yeah.
Because, you know, on that nose you get all that really rich, strong phenolics coming through. You know, you do get that alcohol percentage as well, because these are all done in different amounts. So they're normally set around the 59 to 60% ABV for the Octomores, and we do use a little bit of that Octomore spring water just to bring it back, because, you know, we want to keep that name. Again, Octomore was a distillery that ran for about 30 years, closed down about 100 years ago. There was a couple of brothers that ran it. They had a falling out, and when they took each other to court to see who owned the distillery, and they found out that because it wasn't actually on their land, neither of them owned it, so it hasn't done anything since. So it's a bit of an ode to that old distillery that's been closed down as well.
Yeah, I get this really nice sort of warming sweetness as well in it. That it's just, you guys have to try it. It's kind of hard to just explain it. It's one of those things that you need to really just get to a bar and buy yourself one and treat yourself, because it's exceptional. It's something very, very different. Yeah. And
it's funny, because it's something that I find that, you know, a lot of people that don't like cask strength whiskies, and a lot of people that they don't like, you know, even peated whiskies at all, heavily peated whiskies, they tend to gravitate towards the Octomore within the tasting. So I think that's just, you know, testament to what, you know, Jim started and what Adam's continuing to do now, is to produce this whiskey that really defies logic. And, you know, as we said, it's the impossible equation, because it shouldn't work. And
yeah,
you know,
yeah. It's I have the bottle at home, and the way that I drink it is I will pour myself a nice 45ml sort of serve, and I'll have a few sips, and then as I go, I just like adding a little bit more water, and it does open up, and I find that giving it a little bit of time, it's not something that I drink really quickly, a whiskey like this, and just a couple little drops of water, have a sip, wait a bit, and keep adding, and because the alcohol percentage is higher, it changes every single stage. It's like a journey, I guess, drinking Octomore for me, so yeah, It's great. All right, well, thank you so much for coming in and visiting us and showing off these amazing whiskies. We are going to be doing another video with the Macallan whiskies, which we'll also release really soon. So I just want to say a big thank you. Oh, well, we've got a
That's
video.
right, yes.
It's coronavirus times. And cheers, guys. We'll see you all again on next Let's Talk Drinks. And please hit subscribe, like, comment. Have you tried the Octomore?
Leave some feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to know, because especially if you try it that first time, come back and leave a comment, because it's a really, really exciting whiskey. So cheers.
Cheers.